Rosh Hashanah has a lot about Bal Tiacher, the latest time that you bring a carbon that you're obligated to bring. And also, there's a lot in Masechet Rosh Hashanah about when the year begins. So we're going to study a little bit at the tippy end of Bal Tiacher and begin the long sugya of how do we know when the year begins. So on Daf Vav Hamid Beis, you'll see 3 lines before the end of the Daf. Iboilahu, the Gemara vacillates. Bechar me'emasai monim lo shana. The Bal Tiacher is 1 full year in the case of the Achilas HaKohen with regard to a Bechar. Abai Omer Mishoshen Nolad. We count the clock starts ticking from the moment that the Bechar is born, because the Bechar has what's called Kedusha Mirechem Imo. So as soon as it's born, that's when we begin. The Gemara is going to explain in a minute why. We begin counting off that year. We should only count from the time that you could bring it as a carbon, right? Hartzah miloshen ritzui, and the ritzui carbon means the kapar of the carbon. Again, in the case of Bechar, there really is no machayev of chet, there's no need for kapar, but we use the word ritzui. Ritzui is a generic term that we use universally whenever we want to talk about the efficacy of a carbon, and the carbon can only be brought, the earliest time is after the 8th day. Now, how do we know that a carbon could only be brought after the 8th day? That's already a more complicated sugya. I don't want to get into that now. But the Gemara now says, "V'lo pligi," we can reconcile both Abai and Rav Acha bar Yaakov in the following way. Ha b'tam, Rav Acha bar Yaakov is referring to an animal that can be brought on the Mizbeach. It's a tam, it doesn't have any mum. So therefore the year begins after the 8th day since its birth, because that's when it can be brought as a carbon. And now we begin Daf Zayin. Bal Mum. Abai is referring to Bal Mum, which can't be brought on the Mizbeach, and therefore there's no reason for delay its counting until the 8th day. When does the year begin for Achila? From the moment that the animal is born. So the Gemara now has a problem. It's not really true that you could shech this animal, this Bechar, on the day that it was born. All right, it has a mum. I'm not going to deny that. But you can't eat it immediately after its birth. And the reason for that is because we have to be concerned with the fact that it might be a treifa. Perhaps it won't last, it won't live. And usually a mum is indicative of some sort of a deficiency, physical, maybe there was an injury. How can you possibly eat this Bechar or expect the Kohen to eat this Bechar before 8 days would pass? And then we know it's a viable being. And in effect, what the Gemara is asking is that there's no nafkamina between Abai and Rav Acha bar Yaakov. They both have to agree that you have to wait 8 days. According to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, we have to wait for 8 days because it's a tam, and it's not really lakrov until after its 8th day. According to Abai, it's about mum, and we should be eating it immediately, but we have to delay eating it because it might be a treifa. So the hatchet will always fall on the 8th day. So the Gemara answers the kimle. We're not choshish for a treifa if we know for a fact that the mother carried to term, because that creates a chazaka that the animal is not a treifa, and in such a case you're allowed to shech the animal immediately after it's born. And that's going to be the nafkamina between Abai and Rav Acha in a case where we know for sure it was kololo chadash, it's a viable being. Okay, that's the tippy end of the Sugya Baltiacher. And now we begin the main Sugya, which is the Sugya of determining the first day of the year. When is Rosh Hashanah? Tanur Rabbanan. The Echad bin Nisan Rosh Hashanah l'Chadash. We start counting the months of the year. And very often, as you know, the Torah doesn't talk about the Persian names of the months. It doesn't say Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. That we'll see in the Mishnah. So the Torah will tell me about the 7th month, the 8th month. It'll tell me the holidays of the 7th month, that'll be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur during the month of Tishrei, and the 1st month, which is going to be Nisan, and that's when we celebrate Pesach. When do we start counting the months? The Mishnah establishes that we start counting months. The 1st month of the year is Nisan. How do we know such a thing? The Mishnah the Brisa also establishes Iburim. Iburim means we want to make a Chodesh Me'ubar, and we're going to begin to count from Chodesh Nisan in order to set up a Bezdin for the 1st month of Ibur. The Gemara is going to get into detail about this. The Trumas Shkolim, right? There's a Trumas Halishka, which means that on an annual basis, the Kitzbar collected the Shkolim. Shkolim were placed in the Lishka. And as of Chodesh Nisan, a new year began, and the Machzis HaShekel that was collected will now be used to purchase Karbanos Tzibur. But you can't use last year's money, which means prior to Nisan, to buy the Karbanos for this year. And this year's Karbanos have to be purchased from the New Year's collection. And the New Year begins with Rosh Chodesh Nisan.
Right.
Yesh Omrim Af L'Stiras Batin, which is really interesting. If I rent you a house and the term of rental will terminate at the end of the year, we have to know when the year ends. So, for example, I could rent you a house in the month of Adar, and the stipulation we made was that the rental agreement will terminate at the end of the year. When is the end of the year? It's Rosh Chodesh Nisan, just 1 month later. So in that case, the rental would be 1 month. If on the other hand, I rented you a flat and I said to you, you could have it for the balance of the year, and today is the 2nd day of Nisan, you'll have it for a full year until Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the next year. So the Gemara says, L'chadashim minoah. How do we know that we begin counting the months with Nisan? Maybe there are other candidate months that could be considered the kickoff months, the 1st month of the year for Chadashim. And we would have quoted the same pasuk that the Gemara quotes from Parshas Bo. T'chsiv hachodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chadashim Rishon hu lachem l'chodesh Hashanah. This month is the Chodesh Rishon of all the Chadashim. And this month is the month of Nisan, because the Torah goes on, as we'll soon see in the Psukim, to command us in the midst of Korban Pesach. Abru el bnei al kol adas bnei Yisrael lemor be'asar lachodesh hazeh v'yichu lachem ish sela beis avos sela lebayis. So you take the Korban Pesach and you designate it as such. The lamb is designated for Korban Pesach on this month, which is HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim. Hence, it must be that HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim is the month of Nisan, because Pesach is brought in the month of Nisan. V'ayil lachem l'mishmeres ad arba'as hayom l'chodesh hazeh v'shachatu osa. So you designate the lamb on the 10th of Nisan, and then you protect the lamb. You do shmirah for the next 4 days until on the 14th of Nisan you shech the carbon, you shech the lamb. Uksir, Shmar, Es Chodesh HaAviv. The Pesach should always be brought during the month of Aviv. Now, what does Aviv mean? Rashi has a somewhat complicated explanation of the word Aviv. Let me see if I can find the Rashi here. I had it before. Let me see. Oh, here it is. All right, we'll have to read one more line in the Gemara first. Gemara says, Ezu Chodesh Yesh Bo Aviv, Hevi Omer Zen Nisan, the Karle Rishon, the Ema Iyar, the Inan Aviv Velek. So the Gemara clearly indicates that Nisan is called Aviv and Iyar is not. Rashi explains why. Why is it that Iyar is not a candidate to be called Aviv? Which means Chodesh Yesh Bo Aviv. So let me know if you find the Rashi about 15 lines down from the top. Be'ina Aviv Veleka.
Yeah, got it.
Shekvar Nigmara Min Nisan. The produce had already ripened in the month of Nisan. Well, that's not necessarily true. We have produce that ripens in the month of Iyar. Says Rashi, the Ika Zare Afela Ein Ze Bechir Ela Afil. The Rashi categorizes the ripening of the fruit under two different categories. There's something called Bachir and there's something called Afela. And Rashi expects us to know the difference between Bachir and Afela. But the scholars tell us that Bachir means the beginning of the process of ripening. And that's when the fruits mature in the month of Nisan. However, there's something called Afil, and Afil are sort of the late bloomers, I guess we call them, in modern parlance. So we have the first and the original crops, and that's called Bachir. Those will ripen during the month of Nisan, which is called Aviv. And then we have Afil. Afil is not Aviv. Afil, Rashi says, are the late fruits that ripen in Iyar, but those are really late. That's not the real time for ripening. And the word Aviv means the original Bachir and the ripening. The Ema Adar. Now, the truth is that the Gemara believes that even before Nisan, a month before Nisan, there already are fruits that are ripening on the trees. These are the precocious, like you have a child who already starts talking at the age of a year and a half, too, so sometimes, prematurely, but in a positive sense. So there are definitely fruits that ripen in Adar. So the Gemara says, "Being in Rov Aviv Veleka." Most of the fruits, there's always an exception to the rule, a minority, but most of the fruits will not ripen until Nisan. The Gemara is not happy with that. Midi Rov Aviv Ksiv. The Torah doesn't use Rov as a concept in defining Chodesh Aviv. Chodesh Aviv is when the process of ripening begins, and there's no doubt that one could argue that since there are fruits that ripen as early as Adar, therefore Adar should qualify as the month of ripening, of Aviv. So therefore the Gemara looks for a different answer to the question we know on. El Amar Rav Chizda, how do we know that Nisan is the first of the months? Me'hacham. We're going to derive it from a pasuk in Parshas Emor. When you gather in the Chag HaOsiv, that's in the 7th month. When do we begin to to harvest our crops. Heavy Omer, Zed Tishrei. Tishrei is the time in which the fruits reach their full development, as opposed to Nisan when they begin to develop. And that's when we start harvesting the fruits. And that's called the Chodesh Yesh Bo Asifa. Heavy Omer, Zed Tishrei. Tishrei is the month in which we gather together the fruits from the ground, from the fields. Vika Karile Shvi. And Tishrei is called by the Torah the 7th month. Apparently, we're going to fast forward to Chodesh Nisan and add another 6 months so that we get to the 13th month, which means the first month of the new year, which is Nisan. Gemara is not happy with that either. Maybe the first of the months, which is called the Chag HaOsif, the month of gathering together the fruits, is indeed Cheshvan. And Cheshvan is the 7th month. Umay Shvi, Shvi Li'iyar. If we start counting, I guess you'd count backwards, but in other words, if the 7th month of the year is the month of Cheshvan, then the first month of the year is the month of Iyar. So Gemara answers, Be'inan Asif Aleka. During Cheshvan, that's not a good time to go out and collect the crops because the rains are coming down in Cheshvan. In some areas, it's snow, I think. I don't know if in Canada you have snow now at this time of the year. It's a little early for snow, no?
We can get snow anytime. It might be a little early, but
you haven't had any snow yet. You haven't had any snow yet, have you?
No.
It's
early, but it has happened, like in Cheshvan.
Right. And the truth is that Cheshvan just started not long ago.
Right. So
Rosh Chodesh was on Thursday.
Yeah, it's unusual.
You may have another, 3 weeks. I assume here in Israel, we're going to have some rains very shortly. I don't know, in a week or two. At the end of this week, we're already into Bakosh's Shavim and the rains are going to fall. That's not such a great time for going out to the fields and gathering your fruit. In fact, the Gemara seems to assume in a number of places that the rain, it will be detrimental at a certain point for the crops. We want to dry the crops, not wet the crops. So Cheshvan is not considered the time for Asifa. So Gemara asks, but El, by El time, the crops have long dried in the fields, which, you could have started the whole process way before El. By El time, it's a great moment to go out and gather the crops from the field. So maybe El is defined as the 7th month. Shvi, Umay Shvi, Shvi Ladar. So that would be really cool that Rosh Hashanah, at least as far as the months of the year and as far as the holidays that fall in these months, is Adar. Or rejects this and says, Be'ina Rov Asif Alek. Yeah, you may be able to gather together some fruits here and there, some of the crops as early as Adar, but those are the exceptions. We're going by the Rov.
Right.
And Rov of the Asif takes place in the month of Tishrei. So Gemara is not happy with that either. Midi Rov Asif Siv. When do you begin the process of gathering? It doesn't say that you're very much projected in the process of Asif, which would mean let's wait till Chodesh Tishrei. It's the beginning of the process of gathering, which would logically begin even before Tishrei and El Amar Avina. Dover Zemi Torahs Moshe Rabbeinu Lola Madu. You will not be able to come to any definite conclusion and derive the status of Tishrei as Rosh Chodesh Chodashim from the Torah itself. You're going to have to do it midivrei Kabbalah from the Viyam and Ksuvim. Sometimes the word Kabbalah means the Viyam. Here it means Ksuvim, because the Gemara is going to invoke, amongst other things, Esther, Megillus Esther, which is part of Ksuvim. But first, the Gemara invokes a pasuk in Zechariah Navi. He says, "B'yom esrim v'arbol ashtei asar chodesh u'chodesh Shvat." So the 11th month is called Shvat. Now let's count backwards from 11 to 1, and the hatchet is going to fall on the month of Nisan. When Zechariah Hanavi describes Shvat as the 11th month, he's therefore teaching us that Nisan is the first month. Because Adar becomes the 12th month, and Nisan the 13th month, if you want to call it that, the first month. Rabbi Bar Ula Omar, I have a different source from Megillus Esther, Me'acha. Vatilokach Esther el HaMelech HaChashverosh el Beis Malchuso b'chodesh Hasiri hu chodesh Teves. Teves is defined here in the pasuk as the 10th month. Now, if that be the case, then if Teves is the 10th month, then Nisan is the first month. Teves, Shvat, Adar. So Shvat is the 11th month, Adar is the 12th, Teves is the 10th, and this is all calculating from the first month, which is Nisan. Rav Kana Amar Me'acha. Rav Kana has an alternative source from a pasuk in Navi. In Zechariah Navi, again, we would rather get a pasuk in Navi than Ksuvim. The pasuk clearly indicates that Kislev is the 9th month. Well, if Kislev is the 9th month, then Nisan is going to be the first month. In other words, you have 8 months from Nisan until Cheshvan, then you have Kislev is the 9th month. 8 plus 1 is 9. And once again, we're quoting from Megillus Esther, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Vayikaru Sofrei HaMelech Ba'Isahi b'chodesh HaShlishi hu chodesh Sivan. Well, Nisan Iyar Sivan, if Sivan is the 3rd month, then Nisan is the 1st month. Ravashi Amar Mihacha. Another pasuk in Megillus Esther, Yipil Pur Hu Agorol Lifnei Hama Miyom Miyom Chodesh Chodesh Neim Asar Chodesh Adar. So Adar is the 12th month. It means that Nisan is the 1st month. Ibai Seim Mihacha. Another pasuk. Chodesh Harishon Hu Chodesh Nisan. Wow, that's as explicit as you can get.
Yeah.
The Kulu, my time of Lamridan. Why are all the other Amoraim working overtime, quoting this pasuk and that pasuk? Yeah, state for flourish, as we'd say. So the Gemara answers, Dilma, one could extensively argue, my Rishon, what does it mean that the Chodesh HaRishon is Nisan? The word Nisan, the word Rishon means what? Rishon Lemilseh. In other words, it's Rishon only in this context. It's not making a statement about the inherent status of Nisan, but rather in that particular context, with regard to apparently the story, the scenario of Haman choosing the month. 1 second, there's a footnote here. Let me just quickly summarize this footnote. I guess what it means, Haman was looking for the earliest possible opportunity to implement his terrible plan to annihilate the Jewish people. So he chose to call Nisan, which was fast because that's when he built Pur, and he called it Chodesh Harishon, meaning it's first for his implementation of his dastardly plan. But it doesn't tell us that Nisan is actually the first of the month. It's only relative to that particular episode. B'tana didan, what is Gemara asking now? B'tana didan. But let's go back to the Mishnah for a second. Just to learn, the Mishnah says, Arba Rosh Hashanan be Echad ben Nisan, Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, there's no mention of Chadashim here, is there? Just says Echad ben Nisan, Rosh Hashanah Malachim, Ulir. So why does he omit Chadashim? Where it answers, but Chadashim lo kamayr. Strange halacha. What does it mean, b'chadashim lo kamayr? Chadashim lo kamayr. I think what he means by chadashim, in contrast to shanin. So when you have to write, let's say, for example, a document in a rental agreement, and you write the year, which means that the rental agreement is binding until the end of the year, and then it terminates. So you're looking at the year as a whole. Whereas Chadashim means that we're looking at each month trying to determine the name, in this case, the Persian name of the month, but we're not looking at the year as a whole.
Right.
All right, then we have the Iburim, and we didn't know what that meant. It has something to do with being Ma'aber the Chodesh. So the Gemara says, Liburim mi Nisan mi Moninan. We're going to start our Ibur in Nisan. Well, why should we get together the Bezdin in Nisan? Keep in mind, Nisan is a full year in advance of the Ibur.
Right.
And a lot of the factors that kick into the decision to be Ma'aber will only surface much later on in the year. And it could very well be that the decision to be Ma'aber the Shana will take place much later than Nisan. But Tanya, I'll prove it to you. The Brisa says, Ein Ma'aber Mashana Lifnei Rosh Hashanah. That the time for Ibur is certainly not Rosh Hashanah time. The Ibrua Eina Muberes. The Ibur that was decided upon in the month of Nisan, before Rosh Hashanah, is not valid. Go on in the Brisa. Shasad Chak. We'll see what Shasad Chak is in this context. Immediately after Rosh Hashanah. But there's no mention here of Nisan. The Afal Pichen, Ein Ma'abrim Ela Adar. The only month that we'll add to and extend in the context of Ibur would be the month of Adar. There's no indication here whatsoever that Nisan is the time to be Ma'aber the Shana.
Right.
But Nisan is almost a full year before the Ibur goes into effect. Why would we determine a year in advance that there's going to be a Shana Mubarak? Now, what exactly is Shasad Chak over here? He has a note. Talks about the fact that the anti-Semites would attack Ibur Shana. That was an institution that they didn't tolerate. They would not allow Bezdin to be Ma'aber the Shana. So in such a Shasad Chak, instead of waiting to an ideal time, which means close to Adar, we allow you to set up a decision, a ruling, a proclamation of the Bezdin to be Ma'aber the Shana even before Chodesh Adar. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, my Iburin, we go back to the Brisa, and the Brisa had formulated the ruling that Nisan is the right time at the beginning of the year to make the Ibur Shana Hafsakas Iburin. What the Brisa really has in mind is the termination of Ibur, meaning that the Ibur only impacts on the month of Adar, and once you hit Nisan, it's irrelevant. There's no such thing as a valid Ibur. Isnan, we learned in a Mishnah, and this Mishnah is apparently later on, Hein Heidu, oh, maybe this is in Edios. Give me a second here. So I'm curious to know where this Mishnah is from. A's.
Edios?
Yeah, it's in Edios. It's also in Sanhedrin. Yeah, it had to be Edios because it says Hein Heidu. That's a dead giveaway. Shema Aram Ashana Kol Adar. So the month of Adar is really the ideal time for Ibur Shana. Shayu Omrim Ada Purim. You want to know in advance before the 14th of Adar exactly when it's Adar, because you have Adar Aleph and Adar Beis. Purim is postponed until Adar Beis. So let me know at a certain time, when it's the latest time, that there's a problem and they weren't able to be Ma'aber Adar until a very late period of time. I don't know, what are you going to do about Purim? Are you going to have two Purims because you don't know if they'll be Ma'aber, and then they surprise you and they added another month of Adar? So my time in the Mandi Amrad Purim, we have an opinion here in this Mishnah that we said is in Edios, that you can, Bezdin can offer a decision, a ruling to make the year into an Iber until Purim, as late as Purim. 30 days before Pesach, we already have to start darshaning and teaching the laws of Pesach. Is Asil Zilzule B'chametz. In other words, according to the Tana of this Mishnah, if we're going to allow for Iber Shana as late as the end of Adar, then they will come to be lax with regard to chametz. Okay, so this has to do with the sociology at that time. When they finished with Purim, they would count 30 days immediately after Purim and decide in their minds when Pesach would fall. Now, it's going to be a little too late once we're in the month of Nisan to declare that the year is a Shana Muberes. You're already into Nisan. Nisan is a red flag. That's a cutoff point after which there's no Iber Shana.
Right.
Now, this has to do with the sugya at the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, whether Bezdin will accept the Eidim or not. And if the Eidim testify that there's reason for Iber Shana, but the Eidim came too late, we're not going to accept the Eidim. Now, when the Gemara mentions here Zilzul of Chametz, I think what he's saying is that if they're ma'aber the shana, they might end up eating chametz on Pesach because we don't accept the Iber Shana as late as Nisan is concerned. Once we started Nisan, so if they now extend and postpone Nisan, there might be a violation of chametz. Ve'idach. Okay, we had another Tana in the Mishnah. How are they going to argue against this business about Zilzul Chametz and about Sholem V'Darshim B'Chasab Pesach or Pesach Shloshim Yom? Because they say, "Hey, me Yidushim Avra Shana Kol Chodesh Adar," way beyond Purim. So the Gemara answers, "Meida Yediyah Deshata Ma'abarta B'Chushben Atalia Milsa." So it was apparently public knowledge. Everybody knew that the issue about whether or not to be Ma'abar the Shana, which depended upon many, many different calculations, he says here, people would know that the question whether or not to declare a leap year depends on calculations, and they'll think that the reason for the delayed Iber Shana is that the Chazal, the Bezdin, did not finish the calculations until this time. They realize it's a matter of long deliberations to determine whether or not there are enough reasons to be Ma'aber the Shana. So there was a delay in the Iber Shana. The Shluchim will be sent out and notify the people about the Iber Shana, they'll immediately accept the Eidim, and the word will get around that now there's a Shana Muberes. So therefore, we can even postpone the Iber Shana till after Pesach. I'm sorry, till after Purim, I meant to say. And we can be Me'aber L'Shana up until Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Tana Didan. Wait a second. Who's Tana Didan? Just a second. Oh yeah. Why doesn't our Mishnah mention anything about Nisan as the beginning of the year for Iber Shana? Baschola Kamairi, Bafsokolo Kamairi. So he's only interested in the beginning and not in the culmination period. He writes here in the note that the end of the period when the Beis Din can proclaim a Shana Muberes. Now the Brisa says the Truma Shkolim, that Nisan is the beginning of the year for purchasing Karbanos Tzibur from the Trumas Halishka, the collection of the Shkolim. How do we know this? Omar of Oshia, Omar Kra. The pasuk says, "Zos olas chodesh b'chodsho l'chodshei hashana." So that's a pasuk in Bamidbar. Chadesh ve'havei karba mitruma chadosh. So when he calls it chadosh, it says zos olas chodesh b'chodsho. So he's darshaning it as if it said chadesh. Chadesh means the new shkolim and not the old shkolim. The Gamri Shana min Nisan. The Tzir Rishon Ulachem L'Chodshei Hashana. We have Zos Olas Chodesh B'Chodsho. We have Rishon Ulachem L'Chodshei Hashana. In both cases, we're talking about Chodshei Hashana. So this Gzeira Shava of Chodshei Hashana teaches me that Nisan is going to be the first month for the new Karbanos Tzibur of the new year. Whereas for Ligmar Shana mi Tishrei, I have another alternative Gzeira Shava. Okay, it doesn't exactly say L'Chodshei Hashana, but it says Me'Reishis Hashana, and that refers to Tishrei. That's in Parshas Bo. Where it says Donim Shana Sheyesh Ima Chadashim, Mishana Sheyesh Ima Chadashim, Yein Donim Shana Sheyesh Ima Chadashim, Mishana She'ein Ima Chadashim. So when we talk about Shkolim, we're talking about a Shana Sheyesh Ima Chadashim. Although with regard to Tishrei, it does say Me'Reishis Hashana, but it says absolutely nothing about the rest of the months of the year. Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Omar Shmuel, Karbanos Tzibra Aboy B'Echad Ben Nisan, Mitzvah Lahavi Ben Achadash. So the ideal funds to be allocated for a carbon in Nisan are taken from the lichka that was collected in Nisan, or maybe in Adar for Nisan, for the new year. Im Hevi Ben Yashan Yatza. What does he mean, Yatza? Yatza what? Yatza the carbon, I guess, no? Do you have anything in your Gemara? Any notes about what the word Yatza?
No, it just looks like because he brought it from the new because it's from the new year. That he brought the korban from the new year. So I think that's what they mean, Yatza. It doesn't, there's no
Right, I think Yatza is referring to the carbon. I think you and I both agree.
Yeah.
Trying to avoid the sun here. The shades here don't work so well. The sun is right here in my eyes. Anyway, I will finish up in 5 minutes. El Shechitzer mitzvah. Again, the real mitzvah l'chatchila is to bring the carbon tzibur and Nisan from the new collection of the shkolim. Tanya namihachi carbon tzibur aboin b'yechad ben Nisan mitzvah l'havi ben achadash imhevi ben ayashan yatza el shechitzer mitzvah. Now the Brisa continues. Yachid shesnadev bishalo. So he's not giving for the purpose of his voluntary carbon monies to the shkolim. He's taking monies from his pocket, straight from his bank account. Sharon. And I'm trying to think what the Hava meaning is. Oh, I see. Sharon bilvachi imserem latzibur. In other words, these monies have to be given over to the tzibur because they go to the Trumas Halishka. Now, if it comes to the Trumas Halishka, then that carbon would not be purchased specifically from his monies. He would love to have that advantage and, so to speak, boast. I don't mean that pejoratively, but boast about the fact that they took his monies and they used it for the carbon tzibur. And therefore, this Brisa wants to emphasize bilvad sheyimserem letzibur. We have to buy the carbon tzibur from the money that belongs to the money that belongs to the tzibur. If he's hogging that money as a yachid, we're in deep trouble. It's going to undermine the entire enterprise of a carbon tzibur. A carbon tzibur must be brought from the monies of the tzibur. I might think, I might think that lechush. Meaning, I don't know, this whole thing about kidney, Yafel, Latzibri should have a full-hearted agreement and commitment that the monies belong to the tzibur, and he loses that glory of knowing that they took his monies. Ma'odetema lechush shema, we don't know for sure that he'll have an absolute, honest, shall I say, commitment. Lo yibsreim let tzibur yafa on the top of the Zayin. Basically, mashmalon, the Brisa says, no, we can rely on the fact that a Jew wants the carbon tzibur to be kosher, and he's willing to waive and forego the knowledge and the guarantee that his monies would be earmarked for the carbon tzibur, and he gives the money to the entire tzibur. He's motzah them yafa, and he doesn't have any reservations about it, wanting to claim the the money's for himself. The Tana Didan, the Tana of our Mishnah, why did he leave out this whole discussion that the first of Nisan is Rosh Hashanah for Shkolim? Came under Ketani and Hevi Yatza lo Psikole. Since the Bryce already admitted that it's not absolutely critical that the monies for the carbon come from those monies of the new year, and b'di'evet we fall back in a case where the monies came from last year's Shkolim and we're machshir the carbon. Therefore, our Mishnah is not going into dinim that are only lechatchila to embellish the ideal mitzvah, but they're not critical. That's not the subject matter of our Mishnah. That's called psikol. He says it's not stated as an absolute rule that the first of Nisan is Rosh Hashanah l'shkol, because that would imply that there's a problem even with the Evet. So he omits the entire law. So we shouldn't get the misimpression that we would disqualify a carbon that was brought from the Yashan, from the old Shkol. All right. So that's where we're going to stop for today.
Okay, Shkoyach.
All right. We finally worked out the technology a little bit.
Yeah.